Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my Gaea 2 beginner tutorial series. In the first episode I showed you how to create simple landscapes. In this video I will show you how to create more advanced landscapes by combining and shaping different primitives. If you're new to Gaea and haven't seen the first episode, I recommend that you watch that one first and then return to this video. When you're making a landscape, you usually start with primitive or terrain nodes. Primitive nodes output very basic but also flexible terrain. Terrain nodes are less flexible but are great to quickly create simple landscapes. Almost all of them have parameters to adjust their scale and detail amount. Here I sorted the most common primitive and terrain nodes into categories based on the types of shapes that they create. Primitive nodes are lime green, terrain nodes dark green. The noises create very basic shapes that are extremely flexible, but also very basic. Purlin, multifractal and Voronoi are the most useful ones. Next are some of the terrain nodes. These create various full basic landscapes. These are what I call central nodes. They are very useful if you want to create a single mountain or terrain brushes. The last category is the slopes. They are great for smaller scale scenes. Before you work on any larger or more complicated project, it's important to understand how scale works in Gaea. First, the resolution of a landscape is independent of its scale. Second, everything you do in Gaea happens in this square. If you want to create a larger landscape, you can't increase the size of your workspace. You have to change the scale of your terrain by editing the nodes. Here you can see two landscapes based on multifractal noise. The only difference is the scale of the noise. Larger landscapes usually also require higher resolutions to preserve the detail. A common resolution is 1 pixel per square meter, but depending on your requirements this may vary drastically. Especially when you change the scale of a noise, it's usually necessary to clamp the noise to get the desired height scale. You can do this either with a clamp node or a clamp modifier. Both of these work the same way and squish your terrain into the defined range. Sometimes this makes the terrain a bit flat. You can change this by auto-leveling the terrain first. Auto-level stretches your terrain over the full range from 0 to 1. You can do this by using an auto-level node with a clamp modifier or the auto-level modifier followed by a clamp node. Let's say you used the mountain primitive, edited it a bit and want to integrate it into a larger landscape. You can just directly add it with a combine node, but for a larger landscape you probably need to change the size and position of the mountain. You can do this with the transform node. This node allows you to scale, move and rotate. The simplest way to add the mountain to the terrain is to use a combine node in the add mode. This works perfectly if your terrain has a height of 0 at the edges, but usually that isn't the case and this leads to these visible edges. Another approach is to set the combine node to max. In this mode, the node compares both inputs and selects the highest one at each position. If you want to add the mountain to the landscape without creating ugly edges, use a height node and set the minimum to a really low value and the maximum to 100%. Then blur the result and use it as a mask. Just like with other nodes, masks determine where the effect of primitive and terrain nodes is applied. Since these nodes usually create new terrain and don't modify existing terrain, the terrain that the node would create is multiplied with the input. One easy way to create more variation is to use one of these nodes as an input for another, like for example 2 multifractal nodes. To roughly preserve the height of the second noise, you need to auto-level the first one. One way to easily control the height of your terrain is with the draw node. This node allows you to paint a height map. When you edit the node, you can change the size, hardness and height of your brush. The node also has a soften parameter to blur the output. I'm just gonna pick the largest brush size and maximum height to paint a high area and then an area with a lower height. Currently this node is very laggy and unstable. I really hope this gets improved soon. The biggest problem right now is that it often doesn't get saved correctly. I recommend only using it for simple shapes that you can quickly repaint if it gets reset until this gets fixed. The draw node is great for creating flat areas, but deliberately creating slopes is a lot of work. This can be done with the distance node. The distance node bevels the edges of a shape. It has two modes, but I think the classic mode is more useful in this case. Here you can see what it does to a shape generated by the island node. The fall-off parameter controls the distance of the bevel. If you enable invert output or invert input, you can change the direction of the bevel. You can relatively easily define a coastline by painting a shape with the draw node and then plugging the result into a distance node. You can also use multiple distance nodes and combine them to get more control over the slope. The river node carves rivers into your terrain. In combination with the distance node, this is a great way to control the shape of your terrain and add ridges to your landscape. To do this, take the depth output of the river node and auto-level it. You could also use the river output, but the depth output gives you more control since the color of the mask is determined by the size of the river at that point. Then use a distance node set to classic mode and enable invert input. To get a better looking result, you probably need to use a clamp modifier to control the height of the terrain. You can adjust the scale of the ridges with the threshold parameter. The resolution of your terrain has a strong impact on the results of this technique. I recommend that you adjust the parameters of the distance node in a resolution that is as close as possible to your planned export resolution. This technique alone gives you extremely sharp terrain that is not very detailed. To fix this, multiply it with your initial terrain. Put the distance output into the second input of a combine node and set it to multiply. The ratio determines the intensity of the ridges. After this, your terrain will probably be very flat. To fix this, use another auto-level node with a clamp modifier. With these techniques, you are able to control the structure and shape of your terrain, but the surface is still just based on one noise. One of the best ways to change this is to layer different noises. There are a few different ways to do this, but the easiest one is to simply add another one that has a smaller scale. Your primary noise controls the large landscape features and the secondary adds interesting small scale details. But this is still just two basic noises. You can get less repetitive and more interesting results by warping the noise with the warp or directional warp nodes. Warp pushes your terrain around based on a selectable noise. Directional warp does the same based on the height values of a custom input. You can turn the relatively generic results you get from combining different noises into something more interesting by warping the individual noises and the resulting terrain. Now I'm going to show you an example that progressively uses all of these techniques. First, it's just multifractal noise followed by an erosion 2 node. Then I'm using a draw node to define the highest area. Warp the result and then use two distance nodes that I combine to create the rough shape of the terrain. In the next step, I add a secondary noise to add small scale details and break up the repetition. Then I warp the primary noise with a regular warp node and the secondary noise with a directional warp node. And as a last step, I use the river technique to introduce ridges. The threshold of the distance node controls the scale of the ridges. I can adjust the sharpness of the ridges with the blur node and the intensity with the combine node. Here I have another example that shows you another technique to build a base for a landscape. Move a bunch of primitives around with transform nodes and combine them in max mode. This gives you a lot of control over smaller details. If you pin the combine node with F, you can edit the terrain and easily see the effect on the final result. An annotated version of this project is available for free on Gumroad, the link is in the description. If you have any questions or topics for future tutorials, please let me know in the comments. Goodbye!